The Boy in the Black Suit. Chapter 2. Head to Foot. It's so weird how a person can be a normal part of your everyday life and then just disappear. And when they do, you realize that some of those everyday things go with them, like the smell of food cooking, or the sound of Rick James, Frankie Beverly, or the Isley Brothers playing as background music in your house. The kettle whistling, water running in the kitchen sink. She was always at the kitchen sink, my mom, doing a two-step or something. Her voice and her voices. My mother had a thing for accents. She learned a bunch when she was in acting school way before I was born, which is how she met my father. Well, sort of. She moved to Harlem from South Carolina to be an actress, and when he moved up here from Baltimore to do the same thing. Only difference is she went to acting school, and he went with his gut, as he puts it. While they both waited for their big breaks, they worked in a soul food restaurant. Dad was a dishwasher, and my mom was a waitress, where she tried out her crazy accents on random customers. She said it was always funny when people would get confused, hearing a little country mixed in with Russian, especially coming from a black girl. The French one was my favorite. It was the one she did the most. Oui, never again. Only au revoir. Now the house was totally silent, and it had no smell. It was empty, and for the first time, it actually felt that way. Stale. Old, but I guess new at the same time. My first thought as I walked in was to call out for her, like I normally did when I got home, but I caught myself. Instead, I just at the kitchen table and looked around at all the things that I was used to, that now suddenly seemed so strange. The sink. There was no dishes in it, no pots, no pans. The clock radio flashed 4:04 p.m. in green digital numbers. A photo was taped to the wall just above the faucet of my mother and father when they were much younger, holding my hand on the boardwalk at Coney Island. They looked happy. I looked miserable. I don't even remember taking that picture. It was my first trip to the beach. My mom always teased me about how I didn't understand what sand was, and how I was afraid to let it touch my feet. So I cried most of the trip. The photo had started to change colors, especially at the corners, which were fading into a weird brown, probably because all the steam coming from the sink over the years. I never really cared too much about that picture, but all of a sudden it seemed special. Us as a family. I glanced at the old cooking notebook my mom made for me, sandwiched between the can of sugar and the can of flour on the counter. It was where my mother wrote easy recipes for me to make. It was like her way of passing the cooking torch so that I could do my thing in the kitchen without having to open up one of those lame, thick, usually way too girly cookbooks. I grabbed it and sat at the kitchen table. Written on the blue, nasty saying cover was "The Secret to Getting Girls" for Maddie in my mother's loopy cursive. That was our joke, that cooking is what girls really like. Her telling me that definitely made me feel better about being a dude and knowing what a whisk and a colander are. That's for damn sure. I had tried to open it a few days before, but couldn't do it. Figured I'd give it another shot. I cracked it open, smack dab in the middle. The OMG patty for Maddie. No, sorry, the OMG omelet for Maddie. Thanks for teaching me OMG. Closed it immediately. Even though I was starving and that omelet, the oh my god omelet, would have hit the spot. I couldn't do it. Her writing, I could hear her voice. No. I slid the notebook to the other side of the table like it was possessed, leaned back in my chair, and yanked the refrigerator door open. Bread, butter, half carton of eggs, milk, half an onion turning brown, 2 Chinese food cartons, one with bits of fried rice stuck to the sides, a white plastic fork sprouting from the top, and the other with some sort of sauce caked around the rim. That's pretty much what me and my dad had been eating. Takeout. Obviously. Seeing as though I couldn't even keep the notebook open for 10 damn seconds. I grabbed the styrofoam container with the sauce, shrimp, and broccoli. I sniffed it. Ugh. Chinese leftovers were not on the menu for tonight's dinner. Not unless I wanted the next funeral I went to be my own. Still, instead of just whipping up something quick, we always at least had pasta in the house, and I didn't need to check the notebook to boil water. Off to the bodega I went with $2 crumbled in my pocket. I figured I could talk Jimmy into letting me walk with a sandwich and getting the extra dollar to him later. Jimmy was the guy who owned the bodega. He was probably in his 40s and was from Pakistan, even though everyone in the hood thought it was funny to say he was from Iraq. The only reason I knew he was from Pakistan is because I asked. My mother made me. My mother made me. Don't be ignorant, she used to say. I also know his real name is not Jimmy, but Ahmed, which he also told me. He's a good guy, but he's crazy. One time some dude came in there and tried to steal. Jimmy pulled the biggest knife I've ever seen. I mean, like a machete, from behind the register and started banging the blade on the counter. He started screaming something about this being his neighborhood too. Everybody in there was scared. The guy who was trying to steal just put the chips back and apologized. Jimmy told everybody in the store that day to never, ever try to steal from him, and that if you're short, just say you're short, and he'll try to work with you. He then said that if he catches anyone stealing, he'll leave their fingers on the bodega floor for the cat to nibble on. Gross. But nobody tries to take anything anymore, so I guess he proved his point. I stepped into the store and was greeted by the rank smell of cat litter and cooked cold cut meat. A little bit of mayo, just a little bit, a young guy said to Mike, the sandwich maker, whose name also wasn't Mike, but Tahir. Y'all be getting mad heavy-handed on the mayo. And put sweet peppers on there for me, my dude. Jimmy sat behind the counter, divvying out loose cigarettes, matchbooks, blunt cigars, lotto tickets, and dime candy. Maddie, what's good, baby? He said in his weird mixed-up Arabic New York accent. I'm good, I said, walking up to the counter. Jimmy leaned over a little. Yo, I heard about Miss Miller. Sorry about that, fam. How you holding up? He whispered, trying to be respectful. We good, I said, short, and looked away. I just didn't really want to go into all of that, standing at the middle of a bodega. I didn't even know how he knew. I take that back. Yes, I did. People come in the bodega running their mouths all the time. It was like the only place outside of church you can find out anything and everything about the hood, even though most of it was made up. I kind of wanted to know what he had heard. Like, what were people saying she died from? Knowing this neighborhood, people were probably saying it was a drug overdose, because that's always what people say. Yeah, she used to get high. That's why she was always so funny, they were probably saying. So I didn't even bother to ask. Didn't matter what they thought. I slid my wrinkled dollars up on the counter, almost as if it was a secret note I was passing in class. What you need, my man? Jimmy asked, adjusting his nest cap. I need a sandwich. I'm short a single, but I'll get it to you tomorrow, I said softly. Without even thinking about it, Jimmy took the $2 and threw them in the register, and then he yelled something in Arabic to Mike, who stood behind the meat cutter, holding a turkey breast in his arms like a football. Mike said something back. It all sounded like a whole bunch of throat clearing, but I was used to it. Maddie, you know you family, and I know you or your pops is good for it. Matter of fact, take two, one for Mr. Miller. Jimmy smiled and held out his fist for a pound. I walked over to Mike. He just nodded, which was his way of saying, "Can I take your order?" Let me get a honey glaze on a roll, lettuce, tomato, mayo, provolone, sweet peppers, oil and vinegar, black pepper, meat and cheese. Hot. I rattled off, like naming brothers and sisters I don't have. I've been ordering the same sandwich since I was a kid. It's the way my dad orders. 2 of those, please. 3, a voice came from behind me. Make that 3 of those, Mike. Cheddar, though, not provolone. Don't nobody want all those fancy cheeses. Mike shook his head and smirked. I turned around, already knowing who I'd see. What's up, Chris? What's good, Matt? We slapped hands. What's going on? I've known Chris pretty much my whole life. He lived in the apartment building at the end of the block. And let me tell you, living in a brownstone and living in an apartment building are very different. In a brownstone, you either own the whole house, like us, or the floors are split between 2 other families. 3 max. But the apartment building, it's like 20 families, sometimes more. So it's always a bunch of mess going on. That's how it was in Chris's building. A bunch of mess. Everybody around here called it the crazy building. There's always a gang of dudes posted up outside all night, talking trash, and pushing packs or whatever to whoever. Nobody even parks their car in front of that building, scared that when they come to get it in the morning, it'll be sitting on blocks. And that was probably the truth. Chillin', I said, just grabbing dinner. Mike gave Jimmy my sandwiches, and Jimmy, like always, licked his finger and pulled out a paper bag from underneath the counter. He took the bag and flung it in the air, almost as if he was swatting at a fly, just to open the bag up. Of course, he could have just slipped his finger on the bag to open it that way, but Jimmy likes to be cool. The popping sound the bag made Chris jump a little. Yo, Matt, wait for me, Chris said, putting his soda on the counter and slapping a $5 bill down. I'll walk with you. My house came way before his, so we stopped and sat on the stoop for a little while. I won't lie, it was cool to have someone around. It had been a minute since I had hung out with anyone. Since when my mother transferred to the hospice wing of the hospital, me and Dad spent most of our time with her, opening the get well soon cards and propping them up on the table side by her bed. Dad would always ask if she wanted him to read them to her, but she always said no. Of course, he read them out loud anyway. I think he just wanted to believe she would actually get well. Besides the cards, there was a ton of flowers and balloons that came in every day, from neighbors and friends. Mom hated the balloons. She said they freaked her out at night. Sometimes I wake up with one of those stupid balloons bopping me in the face. I'd be ready to crap myself in here, she said, snorting a little from her own joke. I, on the other hand, hated the flowers. I mean, they're just stupid. Uh, what's the point of getting somebody you care for something they can't do anything with but look at for a few days until it dies? Just seems cruel. But my mom, she loved them. The day she passed, she gave away all the flowers to the nurses, except one bouquet. She said something about them taking up too much space, and that she wanted to give them all a gift for putting up with her anyway, which I'm sure they all deserve, because Daisy Miller was definitely a trip. She told me and Dad to take the last bunch, as well as all the cards. I tried to tell her that we didn't need them, and that she should keep them for herself, but Dad gave me a look that means, just shut up and listen. So I gathered all the cards and notes, and Dad took the flowers. We both thought it was strange, not her wanting to get rid of the cards, but she couldn't care less about them. But definitely her giving away the flowers, or as she called them, her lovelies. But we didn't question it. We just did whatever she asked us to do, and ultimately found out the reason why later that night. My father got the call around 4 in the morning. I wasn't asleep, and neither was he. He'd been down in the kitchen pouring shot after shot of cognac since around midnight. He'd pulled up the bottle out of the cabinet and set it on the table when we first got home. But he didn't drink any, even though my mother would have a drink every now and then. I had never seen my pops take even a sip, but I could tell he was thinking about it, and I couldn't blame him. He just flipped from card to card, reading the get well messages out loud to me like bedtime stories. At one point, I thought he was going to offer me a drink, as some kind of father-son bonding thing, but he didn't. He just let the bottle sit there like it was a third person in the room. I stared at the flowers and thought about trashing them, since they'd be dead by the morning anyway. Pointless. I knew Dad would be upset about it, but I just couldn't keep my mouth shut. We really keeping these? I asked, snatching a petal off. Dad kept reading through the cards. Dad? We might as well just get rid of them. It's not like Mom's gonna care. Shoot, they're gonna die anyway. He paused for a second. Then, like I hadn't said a word, he continued with the corny poems with lines like, back on your feet, and love is the best medicine. I left the flowers alone. Eventually, I dozed off at the table and woke up again, and he was still reading. I got up and headed to bed, kissing him on the head. When I got halfway up the steps, I finally heard the liquor pouring. Then my father hissing as he swallowed the first shot, then pouring again. Hours later, when the phone rang, I didn't hear anything my dad said, but as soon as I heard it ring, I knew. A few minutes after the call, I heard him slowly coming up the steps. Then, there was a knock at my door. Come in, I mumbled. When he opened it, I was already dressed, and from what I could tell, we were both already numb. So what's been going on? Chris asked about a millisecond before stuffing almost half of his sandwich in his mouth. Strings of shredded lettuce hung from his lips. He pushed the stragglers in with his thumb. Not much, man. Just came from work. Work? You working? Where? Chris sounded surprised. I took a gig after school at Ray's, just helping out with little stuff, for work study, and for some extra cash for the house and stuff, I explained. Can't put it all on Dad, I added, still unwrapping my sandwich. Ray's? Like the funeral place? Yeah. Huh, Chris said, while cramming the other half of the sandwich into his face. Watching him eat, all I could think about is how my mother would always get on him about inhaling his food like this. It ain't gonna run away from you, Christopher, she'd tease, while plucking the back of his head. I thought about plucking him myself. You gotta touch dead people, he said. I could tell this was something he really wanted to know, but after he said it, he instantly got weird because he'd said dead people, and now my mom was one. But it didn't bother me. He fumbled. You have to, It was like he was choking on air. Yep, gotta touch dead people, I said, putting my hand on his shoulder and squeezing a little. Come on, man, he shouted, bits of food flying from his mouth. I laughed. I'm just playing, man. I ain't touched no dead people. And Mr. Ray told me I don't have to. I just help out with setting up chairs and stuff like that. Oh, he balled up his sandwich paper and shot it like a basketball at the trash can sitting in front of my house, way off. I could tell he was itching to get his hands on my sandwich paper to try again, but I took my time eating mine. I told him how I felt about school now and how everybody had been treating me weird. James Skinner, and even some of the teachers. He explained that a lot of people wanted to say something to me, or act like everything was cool, but they were scared because they didn't want to make me upset. Everybody thought they were going to say the wrong thing. I told him that I was fine, even though I really wasn't. And I told him that out of everybody, I needed him to hold me down and treat me like normal, just because we had so much history. Treat you normal? He asked, just to make sure he heard me correctly. Yep, like usual? Yep, like usual. Oh, okay. He smiled in a sneaky way, flashing his crooked bottom row. If that's the case, then who's that other sandwich for? He yelled, eyeballing the paper bag. Matter of fact, how about you whip us up some of that Matt Miller magic sauce to go with it? What's the special ingredient again? Garlic powder. The sauce Chris was talking about was something my mother taught me to make a long time ago. It was in a notebook, but I didn't really have a cool title. She said I had to name it myself, so in the book it just says blank sauce. It's a sauce that pretty much goes with everything. Burgers, chicken, and even bodega sandwiches. It's just ketchup, money, mustard, brown sugar, and garlic powder, which really kicks up the flavor of anything you're making in the kitchen. I was going to try to get a Cluck Bucket to pick it up if I would have gotten a job there. Maybe give it some kind of catchy, corny name like All Sauce. That would work. Yeah, garlic powder, Chris nodded, anticipating my answer. No. Come on, man. I thought you said we're going to be normal. We are, but I ain't in the mood to cook nothing. Ain't nobody asked you to cook. Just make sauce, Chris pressed. Then, realizing that I was annoyed, he chilled out. Okay, squash the sauce. Just let me have the sandwich. I laughed and shoved Chris on the shoulder. I guess it would be normal for him to eat his food and mine. The boy was a machine when it came to food. No, it's for my dad, man. Man, he don't want it, Chris argued. I laughed again, thinking at first this was more of a trying to get the sandwich business. But something in his voice caught my attention. Because I just seen your father right before I stopped in the bodega. He's over on Albany, standing outside of the liquor store with that fool Cork. Cork was the youngest Ray brother. He was the brother who they let help out whenever he was around, which was almost never. Mainly because he was always straggling up and down the street with a wet spot in the front of his pants. To say it plainly, dude was a straight up drunk. I don't know what his real name is, but everybody calls him Cork because he drinks a whole lot of wine, and because his face looks like a cork with all the holes in it, which my mother said comes from too much liquor. I knew that if my father was hanging out with him, nothing good was happening. Well, I'm still gonna save it for him, I said, now a little mad. We sat for a while longer, watching ladies push carts filled with groceries and laundry, and kids bopping up and down the sidewalk, talking loud, kicking whatever wasn't nailed down, until suddenly the streetlights started to buzz and flicker. Man, I gotta go, head home, Chris said. You know I don't play with the night. Chris almost never stayed out past dark. Even though he was old enough to hang out later, He still went in when the streetlights came on, just like when we were kids. Not because he had to, but because when it got dark, the stoop in front of his building became a base for those dudes I talked about before, who love to give anyone and everyone a hard time. Just like those losers in the cluck bucket, looking for a target, somebody to mess with. There was this time when me and Chris were like 7, and my folks were trying to have some alone time for Valentine's Day. Chris's mother said she'd babysit me. My dad walked me down there, and when we got to the building, all the guys stood out front, purposefully blocking the door. "Excuse me," my father said to the one standing directly in the way. No response, just flat out ignored him. "Excuse me." This time my father said it louder and got real close to the guy. The dude was just a teenager. But when you're 7, teens seem way older and much bigger. The kid had no choice but to move, or my father was going to, as he put it, bring Baltimore out on his ass. Though everyone was always afraid of what was happening outside of Chris's building, that night me and Chris learned that maybe we ought to be scared of what goes on inside too. That was also the night, by the way, that Chris and I went from good friends to best friends. Here's what happened. Chris and I were laying in the bed laughing like crazy. We were lying head to foot like we always did. But that night, Chris's feet smelled like he'd been soaking them in toilet water. They were so bad we couldn't stop laughing about it, fake gagging and pretending we were going to puke up his mom's way too tomatoey spaghetti. Now that I think about it, it just needed some garlic powder. Despite covering my face to protect it from Chris's toxic toes and laughing like a maniac, I heard something. A bunch of noise suddenly coming from outside. But not outside the building, just outside Chris's apartment door. In the hallway, a couple was arguing. The man was doing most of the yelling, even though we couldn't really make out anything he was saying. Chris and I stopped joking and lay still, listening through the walls. I really wanted to get up and peek out the front door to see if I could hear better or even see something. I don't know why. I guess I was just really nosy, especially since this kind of drama never really went down in my house, where nobody lived but me and my parents. But in Chris's building, there were tons of families, and most he didn't even know. He knew the lady across from the hall, Mrs. Rogers, the old woman next door, on the left, with the barking dog and the weed habit, Mr. Staton, and the girl on the right, Nicole, who at the time were probably 22 or 23, and was me and Chris's first fake wife. But those are the only people he really knew, for the most part, in the whole building. The shouting went on, and I couldn't stop myself. I sat up. "What's going on?" Chris whispered. Going to see what's happening." Chris's eyes went wide. "Are you crazy? My mother would kill us. You know the rules." I did know her rules. Miss Hayes ran them down to me every time I came over. Rule 1. All empty food containers, like Chinese food or even empty McDonald's bags, have to be put in either the microwave or in the refrigerator until we take the trash out in the morning. Do not put it in the trash, because even if it's just crumbs left, mice will get in there. Rule 2. We can't both wash up at night. One of us has to wash up at night, and one of us has to wash up in the morning to make sure she gets to have some hot water too. I didn't really understand this one, but I guess there was only enough hot water for 2 people in the apartment, not 3. Chris and I looked to do rock, paper, scissors to see who got to wash up at night. He was easy to beat because he was one of those people who always picked rock. But I should have let him win that night, so his feet wouldn't have smelled so bad. And rule 3, if you hear any noises outside of the apartment, whether in the hallway or on the street, do not try and see what it is. Just pretend like you don't hear anything. "Come on, man, she's asleep," I said. "We'll just take a peek, and then we'll come right back in here. We'll just crack the door." Chris took a deep breath. I could tell he was mad about me even trying to get him to break his mom's rules, but I really wanted to see what the fuss was about. Finally, he huffed. "Man, you're going to get us in so much trouble." And he was right. If we got in trouble, we were definitely going to be punished for it. My mother gave Miss Hayes the green light to bop me if she needed to, and Miss Hayes was the kind of woman who would do it. "Let's just make it quick," he said, sliding out of bed. We tiptoed into the hallway. Chris put his ear to his mother's door, snoring. I knew she was asleep. We crept into the living room, trying our best to avoid every creak in the floor. Miss Hayes kept their house super clean, so we didn't have to worry about tripping over nothing. We could hear the noises much clearer in the living room. The man was saying something about how much he loved her And how could she have done this to him? All of his words were long, like he was halfway singing, so we knew he was drunk. And the lady was pretty much screaming, it's over," and kept telling him to go home. I couldn't really tell, but it seemed like maybe the man came to wish her happy Valentine's Day, but they were already broken up, and she had had a date with someone else. That was the scenario I made up in my head, at least. Chris turned the bolt lock slowly, making sure it didn't click loud. Then he turned the knob. My heart started pounding, mainly because I didn't want us to open the door and have his mom wake up from all the hollering. But it was too late. Chris was opening the door, and as soon as a thin strip of light from the hall came shining through the opening, the loudest sound I'd ever heard in my life came rushing toward us, making both of us shout and slam the door. Then came the screams of the woman and the drunk man in the hallway, now mumbling something about him being sorry and that he didn't mean it. Chris's face seemed like it had turned blue. Mine felt like it had the same way. "What the hell?" Miss Hayes came rushing from her bedroom, her hair pinned and wrapped in a blue scarf with flowers on it. Somehow I remember that. She flipped on every light in the apartment in what seemed like 2 seconds. I knew we were about to get a whole lot of rough side of the belt, as my mother always said, but I couldn't even worry about that. Miss Hayes looked upset, but then she took one look at our faces and came rushing over. She wrapped us in her arms, her pink robe like a cocoon for us to feel safe in. "What happened?" she asked, but neither of us could answer. Miss Hayes was now on her knees, breathing hard, and the sleep on her breath stung my nostrils. "What happened?" she asked again. The, Chris tried to explain, tears rising in his eyes. The man outside," he stuttered. That's all he can get out. His mother cracked the door, peeked out, then slammed it shut, quickly. She cussed to herself. "You boys get on away from the door," she said, pushing us back. "Matter of fact, go back to your room and stay there. You hear me? Stay there," she added in a shout. No problem, I thought. I wouldn't have minded if we had to stay in their room for the rest of our lives, the way I was feeling. We got back in the bed, head to foot. I didn't care about Chris's stinky feet anymore, and our friendship was pretty much sealed forever. We just laid there, wide awake, listening to the neighbors in the hallways, the police officers and their fuzzy walkie-talkies, asking questions, but nobody saw nothing. The ambulance sirens, the screams of what sounded like a little girl, and Mr. Stan's dog, barking all night long. That was the end of chapter 2. That chapter gave us like a lot of insight on like who Chris is, and the kind of relationship that Chris and Matt have. And I think that relationship is really important because, you know, Matt's obviously going through a tough time. And it also gives us some insight on what his dad's feeling like right now, especially since his wife had just died. And it said that he's resorted to drinking, which, later down in the story, it might make Matt's life even harder. And that is chapter 2.